Thank you for joining us for this event that we're calling Argue More, Argue Better. Civic participation was a key part of Robert H. Jackson's life. From his time practicing law here in Jamestown, through his federal government service, as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and as the U.S. Chief of Counsel for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Writing on, speaking on, and debating the issues of the day also occupied him. He started orating as a teenager, and as an adult, one of the forms of entertainment in Jamestown, as well as other local towns, was something called the Saturday Nightclub, a gathering of interested persons who would debate and discuss the issues in the news. We have hosted a small handful of community conversations to carry on this tradition and look forward to hosting more. These days, we all seem a little less eager to engage in these discussions. In fact, we had a comment on our social media for this program along the lines of, "I am tired of arguing," and I can certainly understand that sentiment. That being said, discussion and debate and active listening are muscles we need to continuously exercise or we lose them. So, we thought it would be helpful to take a step back and learn why we struggle with these conversations and how we can get better at them, which I honestly hope encourages all of us to have more of these conversations. To help with this, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Andrew Perrin to you. He is the chair of the Sociology Department and the SNF-Agora professor in the Sociology Department at Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He is a cultural and political sociologist working on issues of democracy, including civic engagement and effects on higher education and public. Perrin's research explores what people need to know, do, and be to be effective, creative, and thoughtful democratic citizens. He also has studied public opinion and letters to the editor, college education's effect on civic engagement, children's movies, and obesity. He writes on the intersection of culture and democracy and is an author or co-author of 5 books, including Citizen Speak, The Democratic Imagination in American Life, and America Democracy, From Tocqueville to Town Halls to Twitter. To perhaps frame his talk today, Dr. Perrin recently participated in an analysis of the September presidential candidate debate, where he said, "The thing we are missing most in our public discourse is access to good disagreement. Most people will talk to and read stuff by people who they tend to agree with and are pretty isolated from really good competing arguments." We hope tonight's program encourages you to seek out these conversations. Dr. Perrin, if you please.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you to the Robert Jackson Center for the invitation, and thanks to you all for joining us this evening. As Kristen said, I am a cultural and political sociologist, which means I'm interested in the social and cultural pieces of how our democracy works. And almost all of my research and writing has been in particular, has been on the sociology of democracy. And so when I say that, I want to hopefully give you maybe a little different angle on how to think about both the failures and successes of democratic citizenship. Hopefully, I hope that you'll be able to leave here thinking maybe that you're not quite so tired of arguing, but maybe even that we might have some skills that'll let us to argue better and not just argue more. Let me tell you briefly that at the bottom of each slide, you will see this QR code and URL, the polev.com URL. And you can use either of those to submit a question or a comment along the way to me, whether you're in the theater there in Jamestown or you're online. And so that way I'm happy at any point along the way to try to shift gears or answer something that's burning that you'd like to ask. And of course, we'll also have time for Q&A at the end of the talk as well. As Kristen said, I do work now at Johns Hopkins University, where I'm in the SNF-Agora Institute, which is a wonderful interdisciplinary center for the study and promotion of democracy. And I'm really lucky to be here. I've been here only about 3 years. I spent the majority of my career at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and actually spent some time as well in Western New York. I lived a couple of times, both as a child and a young adult, in Rochester and in Brockport. So I'm happy to virtually visit back to some areas close to some of those places that I once lived. Um, Let me start by bringing a couple of quick pieces of background. First, many of the ideas in this book come from in this talk, come from my ongoing collaboration on a book project with Chris Lundberg of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've learned a ton from Chris. We're finishing up a book now on the ways Americans argue badly in public and what that means for our democracy. I have to give Chris credit for helping me develop many of the ideas and approaches I'm going to offer you today. Secondly, my father-in-law always loved this book, Why You Lose at Bridge. And in particular, he loved its audacious title that presumed that the reader of the book or its purchaser in fact lost at bridge, and all that we needed to answer was why. And I've been thinking a bit that you might think about this project that Chris and I are doing and the talk today, perhaps as why you lose arguments. So I want to talk a bit about the ways argument fits into a broader, maybe a more sociological, social, cultural way of thinking about democracy, and circle back around to some of the ways that our argument culture is broken and could be better. So when most people think about democracy, and sometimes people ask when they say, I study democracy, whether my work is historical fiction. And I don't think so. But usually when people ask about democracy, they're thinking about maybe things like legislatures, maybe documents like the Bill of Rights, maybe the rights themselves that go into democracy, maybe the nominating conventions where we choose who is going to run for president and for office. Maybe even people are thinking about social movements and protests. But mostly at the core of what almost everyone says when they are thinking about democracy, whether that everyone is my students or people I talk in talks like this, people I meet in other areas of life, most at the core of what almost everyone says is something about voting. And I understand actually that this voting machine, which I have lots to say about at various times in my work, that this voting machine for over a century was manufactured there in Jamestown. And it's one of the ways that we came to understand and imagine ourselves as the right kind of private citizens in a public democracy. This image actually comes appropriately enough for today's talk from the Smithsonian Institution. Many of us may remember voting in a machine like this, maybe coming in with a parent voting in this machine, as I remember growing up in Western New York and in Tennessee. We learn a lot from how this machine works. Even though we don't use it anymore, I think it's important to work through what we might learn from the process of voting in a machine like this. You're walking into a space doing the thing that is arguably the most public thing that many citizens do. You're voting. You're participating in a democratic process. The first thing that you do when you walk into this big green machine manufactured in Jamestown, you walk in, you pull that giant red lever to the right, and behind you closes a curtain, separating you, certainly optically and certainly physically, separating you from the community on whose behalf you're voting, and inclusion in which is the reason for the vote itself. So the machine tells you your vote belongs to you. It is private. It is not about the community. It is not about the collectivity. It is about yourself. You then mark the candidates you'd like to vote for, the ballot questions, using the little levers above the red lever. And then when you're done and when you've expressed yourself most publicly in this most private of settings, you turn the handle back to the right. The vote is cast and recorded. The curtain opens and you re-enter the community. You're back in the presence of your fellow citizens. Um, I think I say this to give you a sense of how I think about democracy in a sociological or a cultural way. We can think about this as a semiotics of votings. The semiotics is the science of signs. We can think about it as a semiotics of voting. That is, what do we learn from the voting process? And we learn that our job as voters is to express our private principles and our private preferences as part of a public process. In 1991, I had the great privilege and pleasure of going to Zambia. I was living then in Namibia, which is in the southwestern corner of Africa, and I had the opportunity to go to Zambia to witness as an official election observer the first and sadly only free elections in Zambian history. And I took a photograph there of this gentleman. Um, Voting during this first free elections. He's up in the northern area of Zambia known as the Copper Belt, and he had waited for hours outside outside of a small shack to be given the opportunity to vote for what was clearly the first time he was going to vote. I love this photograph because it shows this man understanding the weight of his society and his country on his shoulders. It shows the weight that he gives the process of voting and the fact that he is now able and allowed to vote. Um, I then rode with his ballot and many other ballots on a giant truck that drove them all in these locked boxes down to Lusaka, where the ballots were then spread out on giant tables while ballot counters counted them by hand and assembled the individual votes of the Zambian voters into the victory for Frederick Chiluba and his movement for multi-party democracy, which won those elections. President Carter was there as another of the major observers. And one of the things it taught me was the giant symbolic and cultural import of voting in elections. It was certainly important who won the election, but the fact of voting itself, the cultural process that it signified to people like this gentleman, was at least as important. When we can think about democracy as in a certain sense as a way of offering people voice. And here I like to think about democratic voice by referring to Norman Rockwell's famous painting, Town Meeting. Here in the town meeting, an apparently working class man is standing at a rail at presumably a town meeting. He's disheveled, but he's determined. He's respectful yet confident. Literally hat in hand, he looks up, grasping the rail, while a cadre of more respectable folk, who are all sitting down, and by the way, they're wearing neckties and scarves, he is not, they gaze up at him as he prepares to make a point. The speaker's mouth, along with those of everyone else portrayed in the painting, is closed, presumably in deference to an authority located outside of the painting. Town meeting, and all the more so its more famous successor, freedom of speech, in which the speaker appears more defiant and his audience has gained copies of the town's annual report. They illustrate the ideals of defiance, individualism, the erasure of class privilege, and the communicative competence that run through our common sense ideas of how communication of democracy ought to work. And my kids tell me, by the way, that this second painting, freedom of speech, has become a meme on Instagram, a way of signaling that the speaker or the person who's posting has something they feel is important to say. I do want to emphasize that these ideas of voice transcend both political position and historical period. This is from a 2010 Tea Party rally in North Carolina. It was taken by one of my research team. And you can see that this sense of standing up and giving voice remains a central way that Americans think about the importance of our work as citizens in a public sphere. So I want to suggest to you then that we not think about democracy as being a particular set of laws, a particular set of institutions, or even a set of norms, but rather that we should think sociologically about democracy as the set of practices that people use to share a polity with people different from them. Now, what does that all mean? First, let me say that democracy is fundamentally about practices. And practices in sociology, we talk about these things as being patterned or institutionalized, but very much shared ways of behaving. Practices are the ways that people share their actions across a culture or a society. They're familiar. There's the practice of voting. There's the practice of eating at a restaurant. There's the practice of commuting. There's the practice of marriage, of employment. These are things that people are familiar with and they're able to enact as parts of a society or a culture. And democracy is one of the, or several of the practices that we share as a society. There are things that we use to share a polity. And when I say a polity, I basically mean a society, but it's the political side of society. It recognizes the fact that society is not just a sort of friendly combination of people, that indeed the polity is a point about the ways that society is organized into political divisions, into ways that we share the opportunity and the ability to make decisions that matter as a collectivity. And finally, there's no point in democracy if it's not in some way about difference, right? If you could imagine a society in which everyone was the same, it would be unimportant to think about democracy. Everybody would want the same thing and we would just do it. So democracy is only important in the context of recognizing, dealing with, and adjudicating the differences between people and groups of people in society. We can think about these differences as standard demographic differences like race, class, gender, sexual identity, ethnicity. Also, we can think about them as true differences in values. What do you think is good and bad, right and wrong? Differences in the experiences that people have. What makes them more optimistic or more cynical? What makes them more cautious or more adventurous? And just plain old idiosyncratic differences. People are different from one another. Democracy is relevant only because democracy helps to adjudicate these differences between people and help us share a polity. In this sense, I want to suggest that democracy is itself our social argument. And the quality of that argument is the quality of our democracy. So if you buy that, and I'm going to suggest why I think that, if you buy that democracy is itself our social argument, I want to look at the question of what makes for good arguments and what spaces there might be to foster those good arguments. So taking a quick step back, we can look at the common diagnoses of democratic dysfunction. Right? People talk about the polarization of our society, which is basically just saying that the differences that we were talking about a moment ago are big and they're important. We can talk about what the fancy word is epistemic closure, which you can just think of as being the fact, excuse me, being the fact that we live in bubbles where we listen mostly to people who we already know what they think and we already agree with them. We're echo chambers. Many people are worried about incivility in politics. Perhaps that's what the person on social media meant when they said they were just tired of arguing so much. And we worry all the time about misinformation and disinformation, the ways that people get bad information from the argumentative and conversational systems that they're part of in life. In particular, I want to talk about the fact that we talk so much about information. And I'm going to suggest to you later in this talk that our focus on information is actually, it's actually a distraction. And it keeps us from actually having the big value-based discussions about good and bad, right and wrong, real disagreement that we ought to be thinking of when we think about good democratic argument. So we think about misinformation and disinformation, disinformation just meaning misinformation on purpose. We can think about propaganda, right? We can think, therefore, about what are the ways that people are duped into believing things that they shouldn't believe. And everybody's worried about the fact that this all seems to happen on social media, that social media makes those debates happen faster. It makes them happen with less evidence and less careful thought. And it seems to make them happen in more echo chambers, more filter bubbles, where it's less possible to actually get out of your echo chamber and understand better what's going on. And we get this from both sides, right? So the left might say that our democratic dysfunction is built upon the refusal of conservatives to believe the science. They might say that willful misinformation leads to dangerous behavior on the part of others, that the right lacks a moral sentiment or ignorance of systemic justice, and is entirely ideologically mediated, which means basically the left accuses the right of believing what they believe only because of the ideology that they already hold. Meanwhile, a lot of the charges coming from the right to the left actually have the same similar structure to them, right? That liberals live in a space of institutional mediation, the swamp, the media, the deep state. That the left is focused entirely on identity politics, on that is, and what you believe is because of who you are. That real normal Americans are not granted the opportunity for authentic voice. And again, just like the other way, that liberals actually only believe what they believe for ideological reasons and not for reasons of difference in belief or interpretation. Both of these sides share a presumption, and the presumption is what Chris Lundberg and I have called the information hypothesis. We can get this from a relatively liberal speaker, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's famous quip that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And we can get it from a right-wing commentator saying very much the same thing. Facts don't care about your feelings. Although my colleague Liliana Mason has been doing some really terrific psychology work in which she says what we really ought to be saying is feelings don't care about your facts. And that we need to understand the role emotions play in organizing how people function as citizens and as arguers. Both sides, though, share what we call the information hypothesis. This is a shared commitment to the idea that evidence and facts are the terrain for dispute. They're the thing that we should be arguing about. And I think that one of the things that we're going to learn again later in the talk, one of the things I'll try to convince you later on, is this strong emphasis on information, on facts, and not on argument, values, and interpretation actually hampers our ability to have good arguments as citizens. We should recognize that while facts and evidence discipline argument, they don't exhaust it, and that good arguments aren't just about people not having the right or the same pieces of information, the same facts. The information hypothesis has a set of implications, as I suggested, that better facts will make for better decisions. That disagreements can be settled by reference to facts outside the disagreement. Imagine, for example, what liberals might say about climate change, what conservatives might say about vaccine usage, or what many people on both sides say about the facts of the 2020 election. The information hypothesis implies that the reason we disagree about the values and the right policies surrounding these big questions that face our entire society is because of differences in the facts that we have, the information that we have. But again, I think that's actually not really true. It gives rise to some misunderstandings of how information works. It gives rise to the implication that information is an object or a product, that it's outside the process that gave rise to it, that we can get information without understanding where it came from, what it means, or how it's partial. The information hypothesis implies or presumes that information is content and that communication is only the neutral conduit that carries it, that communication is not part and parcel of information itself, and that therefore information is just facts. It's not functional. That what information, we should understand what information is not just a set of facts, but rather that which informs. It's an active thing. And so we can think instead, where the information hypothesis implies that information is correcting and completing, that giving the right information, getting the right facts is the end of the argument, it completes the argument. In fact, we think adequate information is a necessary condition, but far from the end of a good argument. Furthermore, the politics of that fourth position are actually totalitarian. They try to get rid of difference, to take that valuable difference I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. Instead of engaging with that difference, they try to use the facts to get rid of the difference, to make it go away. And in that sense, they actually are, it's an anti-democratic, an undemocratic way of thinking about how argument ought to work and how we should think and talk as citizens of the country. All of this gives rise to the search for the elusive superfact. The superfact is the thing we call that one fact that is once indisputably true, that no one can offer any retort to the truth of the fact, but that also conclusively demonstrates that the opponent is not just wrong, but is morally bad. And if you take a look at debates, whether they happen on Twitter or now gets called X, or they happen elsewhere on social media, whether they happen in a debate hall on a university campus or around a table, this emphasis on trying to find the superfact that demonstrates that it's indisputable and it demonstrates that the opponent is wrong and that they're wrong morally as well as factually. Once you're tuned into this, I think you'll see it throughout many of our big debates that we have. The problem, though, is twofold. One, there's no such thing. Superfacts don't exist. There is no, and I mean no, not just rare, no indisputably true fact that everyone agrees is a fact and that conclusively demonstrates that the opponent is not just wrong, but morally bad. The thing doesn't exist. More importantly than that, however, is the fact that searching for them distracts us from listening to others' arguments and formulating our own arguments well. Because we're looking for the thing that's outside the argument, that's a fact that existed beforehand and just has to be discovered, it keeps us as good arguers from listening well to what our opponents are saying and from formulating good arguments based on facts, based on evidence, but not exhausted by fake facts and evidence that would be more convincing and potentially actually win or persuade an opponent in an argument. Okay. So what should good communication across difference look like? Instead of constantly looking for those non-existent superfacts, what should we try to foster in terms of good communication across difference? I tend to think a couple of things. I think it is true that good communication across difference should be civil. That is, we should try to be kind and reasonable and calm in talking with one another. But more important than that, it should be frank. If you can't make the point you need to make and be civil, you should still make the point. It's more important at the end of the day that all of those diverse and different points of view, those different ideas, those different disagreements, it's more important that those get out than that they get out civilly. I do think civil is good. I think you should try to be civil, but it's more important to say what needs to be said. So frankness beats civility if they're in contest with one another. Similarly, I think it's really important that what you say is accurate, right? That we want people's statements in public to be correct and to contain as little untruth as possible. But once again, I'm going to say there's a greater value, and the greater value is not just accuracy, it's actually thoroughness, or we can think about this as context. What does the fact mean? What does the information mean to the argument or the discussion happening in the discussion at the time? And so for civility, we're thinking about the concept is rooted in the civic, meaning for the good of the people, kindness, generosity. We're thinking about emotional coolness and listening well. But for frankness, it's really important that we be expressive, that we be honest. The Greek term parousia, which means the fearless truth-telling, and that frankness itself can be understood as a weapon of the weak. It's that very often marginalized groups, people who are otherwise disempowered, are accused of being uncivil, and it's because they're being frank. They're saying what they need to say. Similarly, when we think about accuracy, right? Get the facts right. Make claims about others in the world that are true, documented, and based in evidence. but it's at least as important to be thorough and give enough context, to provide not just the facts, but enough facts to understand what those original pieces meant. What does it mean? Why do we say the thing that we're saying? And to understand the context and history within which that information was represented or was produced. That is, what we're trying to do as speakers in a good argument, in a good conversation across disagreement, is not just to convey information, but to generate meaning. That is to say, why should you believe what I believe? Why should you consider my side of the argument? And so when we think about thoroughness, we're thinking about not just having those facts, but getting those facts in context and making them work well. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about a principle that we use, another of these big terms that Chris and I have been working with, which we call repressive desublimation. There's no real need to talk about the technicalities of the term. But one of the things that we've observed is that looking at that accuracy and thoroughness slide from before, is that indeed, if you look at most of the information that people gain, even from some of the worst social media discussions, some of what we might call the bottom half of the internet, the comment tools under news stories, some of the most difficult and contentious arguments online, what we actually find is most of what's published there, most of the claims people make are actually true. It's just that they're not thorough. And it's just that they're not placed in context. And so I want to talk briefly, do a little analysis here of these two symbols. These two symbols are powerful, what we call enthymemes. An enthymeme in the philosophy of Aristotle is an argument in which at least one premise goes unstated. It turns out that enthymemes are really helpful ways to try to convince people, because if they've had to imagine what goes into an argument, it's actually stronger than if you give them the whole argument. So during the Trump administration, a sign became commonplace in front yards across college towns and other liberal leaning neighborhoods. It says, "We believe Black Lives Matter. No human is illegal. Love is love. Women's rights are human rights. Science is real. Water is life. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Each of the slogans on the sign, of course, was well known before the signs themselves started popping up. Indeed, each one represented one or another social movement from the last 10 or 15 years. Black Lives Matter, of course, emerged in the wake of a string of police killings of Black people across the United States, and its simplicity made it at once a popular social media hashtag and a potent movement. No human is illegal combines a moral statement with a lexical point, that is referring to the common shorthand by which undocumented migrants are labeled illegals. The slogan highlights the injustice of the shorthand while also representing support for these migrants. Love is formally a tautology, of course, because everything is the same thing. It expresses the claim that lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and other sexual minorities should be treated equally. Essentially, the tautology implies all love is the same, though it's not clear whether adherents would agree with the boundary cases of this, but that's the implied claim of the slogan. Women's rights are human rights expresses a straightforward value. It does so, though, through attaching women's rights to an implied universal standard, human rights. But human rights themselves are far from uncontested, particularly with respect to gender and sexuality. I'm going to leave science is real alone for the moment, move on to the question about injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere. It's a direct quote from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. Arguably his most radical text, the letter argues for mutuality and connectedness among social justice priorities. I want to call attention to this sign for two reasons. First, through the combination of these slogans in a single visible text, the sign declares a connection that's not present in each of the slogans separately. Second, the focus on the science is real slogan, it's an important claim on the nature of truth and the role of evidence in public argument. Interestingly enough, the sign begins, "We believe," although a variant asserts, "We know," a bold assertion that also calls into mind Ronald Reagan's quip that the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's that they know so much that isn't so. This variant has also reordered and the slogans, and it's dropped water is life, and it's dropped injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And the use of rainbow colors in love is love evokes the LGBTQ plus movement's use of the rainbow flag. In opening with we believe, or later we know, the sign signals two things. First, it establishes the list to follow as something of a creed. It's a list of principles which one might not believe, but which in combination form a coherent whole. Second, it identifies the person displaying the sign as someone adhering to that creed, an identity. I am the kind of person who believes this creedal list. As statements, though, each of the statements makes a different claim, both as to truth and as to value. To claim, for example, that women's rights are human rights is most straightforwardly a claim to truth. Women's rights are indeed included in every major statement about the scope of human rights, so the truth value of the claim is relatively safe. But the reason for making the statement is not its simple truth. Included by implication is the value statement that human rights are important. Otherwise, why would it be of any interest simply to state that women's rights are included in human rights? Contrast to that the argumentative structure of the slogan with another, Black Lives Matter. A lot of work is done by the word matter here. If the slogan is taken as a claim about truth, it's actually counterproductive. Imagine the word already inserted between lives and matter. That would be Black lives already matter, if that were the statement read as a declaration about how the world currently is. But of course, the slogan is not intended as a statement of fact, but rather one of value, inserting the word should between lives and matter. That is, Black lives should matter. Read in this way, the phrase actually implies the opposite of its factual reading. It implies that Black lives actually do not currently matter, a fact that warrants the slogan's utterance. Because of this diversity among the slogans, what holds the sign together is the co-presence of the slogans on the sign. More than mere shorthand, the sign as a coherent text indicates both the value claim that each slogan shares moral importance with the others and the truth claim. Did someone need to? And the truth claim that these values entail one another, that believing one should make you believe the others. Moving then to the other sign on the slide here, right? Imagine what the MAGA hat shows, right? Returning to our contrast between this sign and another ubiquitous utterance, "Make America Great Again." MAGA, unlike the slogans on the sign, MAGA is imperative. The implied subject is you, the reader, wherein the sign is explicitly we. That is, we believe in this home we know. MAGA is nostalgic, right? It implies that America both once was great, that it no longer is great, and there are things that could be done to make it great once again. So MAGA is a very different kind of declarative claim than the sign is, right? It is entirely contentless. There's lots of space for the audience to fill in the specifics. Both of these artifacts, the sign and the MAGA hat, both of these artifacts are enthymemes. They ask the audience to imagine some things that's not contained in the message itself. But in doing so, what they do is they invite us in to think about what kind of a person we are, what kind of a citizen. Most importantly, though, none of these arguments persuade. It's actually nearly impossible to imagine viewing a person wearing a Make America Great Again cap and saying, Eureka, you're right, America was once great, it could be great again, and we should make it so. And it's nearly impossible to imagine a person walking down a tree-lined college town street, seeing one of these signs in a yard and saying, you know what? I actually agree. I didn't think before that science was real, but now having seen the creedal sign, I now believe that science is real. It's not possible to think about these arguments as persuasive. They're questions about who we are. That a MAGA hat identifies you as a particular kind of person, and the signs are very clear that display of these signs makes you a kind of household or a kind of person. All of this leads to 4 argumentative traps that we identify in the ways that we argue, and that we think both the sign and the MAGA hat are just examples of the ways of the 4 argumentative traps that I think that we keep falling into. And I've given you here a photograph or a diagram actually of something called the Chinese finger trap. The Chinese finger trap, as you probably know, if you ever won one in a skee ball contest, or if you ever picked one up from a 5 and dime store, the Chinese finger trap, you slip it over 2 fingers, and the more you try to pull those fingers out, the tighter the finger trap gets. And it's impossible, actually. The more you try to pull, the tighter it gets and the harder it gets to get rid of. Of course, the trick to getting rid of the Chinese finger trap is actually to move your fingers closer together, thereby loosening the grip and using one to pull the trap off the other. Like the Chinese finger trap, each of these 4 argumentative traps presents a way that people try hard to engage in arguments that turn out to work against persuasion and against listening well and engaging across difference in good argument. The first is the one I've talked about already quite a bit in this talk, the information trap. That is the idea that all you got to do is make sure you've got the same facts, and then the argument's going to be done. The second of these is what we call the affinity trap. That is, people like me believe this, and therefore I believe it too. Now, sometimes it's reasonable, right? That you trust others who are more like you, and so you choose to make decisions, make political, cultural, social decisions, and believe things because people like you believe them. But what we saw with those 2 objects before, the MAGA hat and the sign in people's yards, is that all those things do is serve to say, I am a person like me and I'm different from people like you. But they don't actually let us understand the nature of that difference or try to bridge it in any way. The third argumentative trap is experience as argument, or what we call the identity trap. That is, I was there, this happened to me, therefore my argument is right. Now, experience is a crucially important part of any argument. It's always the case that when you put yourself out there, when you make an argument in public, you're making an argument in part based on the experiences that you have and the shared sense that those experiences matter. But to say that the argument is correct because you were there and you experienced it is to misunderstand, if you will, to pull Trump, with no pun intended, on your opponent by simply saying, you're not me, you can't understand. But democracy, because it relies on difference, because it relies on our ability to communicate across that difference and to adjudicate those differences well, to say you're not me, you can't understand, is to shut down those democratic conversations. Finally, the one I've been writing on the most recently is called the history trap. And it's the sense that because the history of a given practice, a given country, a given place, a given outcome, because that history is as it is, we can never expect things to change. That is, things always are as they always were. That's not true, first of all. History is more, if anything, more about the process of social change than it is about the process of social stability. But we end up having a lot of our big arguments in our society around questions of history, including, by the way, the Voices and Votes exhibit that is or was at the Jamestown Museum right now. The Voices and Votes exhibit is largely an exhibit about history. But how do we interpret that history? What does it mean to us? When does it change and when does it not? When are those changes productive and when are they not productive? Those are the things we need to build on top of a history argument, instead of stopping simply with, I understand the history and it is now as it always will be. What then might better argument look like? I've given you a bunch of diagnoses of the ways that our argumentative structure, the way we talk to one another, has failed. And I do think that our democratic conversation is in tatters. Um, and we can talk a bit about some of the background and the reasons for that. But I think it's reasonable to say that we simply aren't doing a good job of having a good democratic conversation, and therefore our democracy is threatened. I think the direction goes that way. I think that it is first the breakdown of our conversation, and therefore the breakdown of democracy, and not the other way around. I do think that the fundamental goal needs to be to argue more, not less, because it's those arguments that are at the core of democracy. But we need to learn to argue better. And arguing better doesn't mean not disagreeing. It doesn't mean just being nice when people say things you think are wrong. But it means using evidence to improve discussion and asking questions like some of these, trying to say in public not just what we believe, but why we believe what we do. What is it that goes into your belief, your preference for one way or over the other? Why do you think your opponent believes as he or she does? What do you think is going on there? Um, what foundational values direct our beliefs? It may well be that we simply can't get to an agreement on one or many, maybe many different positions that people hold, different values people have. But at least we can articulate what those foundational values are and why we hold those disagreements. I actually think I published an op-ed in the Seattle Times about 2 weeks ago arguing that the reason that the encampments over the Israel-Gaza war this past spring were so ugly and so difficult for so many people on both sides was because we had done a bad job of actually having those big, difficult, value-laden debates beforehand, where people could argue not about things that are easy, but about things that are hard. And that having those hard arguments and respecting and understanding why we disagreed might have actually prevented at least some of the worst excesses of the encampments and of their responses. I think it's really helpful to set up goalposts, and in fact, to ask your opponent, is there anything that you could discover to be true that would actually change your belief, your position on the thing we're arguing about? And because one of the things that we're all inclined to do, we know this from lots of good social psychology research, is that everybody wants to stay right, even if they've been demonstrated to be wrong. It's really hard to admit that your position was wrong. So if you can set up some markers ahead of time and say, well, if I could convince you that the following fact was true, the following piece of evidence was out there, would that be enough to change your beliefs? And maybe they'll say yes, and then you've got your work cut out for you. You can go out and sit down and try to figure out, in fact, is that piece of evidence available? Maybe it's going to turn out not to be true. I was working with one person who was really convinced that the most important reason why conservatives should drop their objection to transgender surgery for minors was because very little of it actually happens. And he was quoting lots of numbers of the number of surgeries that happened. And I said, well, we can talk about that, but let's imagine who your opponent is in this debate, in this discussion. Do you think your opponent would think that their position was wrong if it just didn't happen very often? Or are they making an argument that doesn't depend on the frequency with which these surgeries were happening? So setting up some of those goalposts, what could we discover to be true that would change our beliefs? And then finally, listen carefully for evidence and for warrants. I actually think a really important goal for a big, value-laden, difficult discussion across disagreement where people have different values and different beliefs, a really important goal for such a conversation is, can we understand and articulate our opponent's values and claims faithfully? Right? That doesn't mean agreeing with them, doesn't mean thinking that they're valid even, but can you say what they think in a way that they think that they would agree with? Far too often, all of us, and I include myself in all of us spend so much time caricaturing and determining what our opponents must believe that we don't actually sit down and figure out, what do they think they believe? What are they trying to argue? And I don't want to make any claim that doing all of these things is going to make us into a beautiful utopia where everybody's happy and we all just agree. In fact, I hope it doesn't. I think disagreement is good stuff. I think democracy thrives when we're disagreeing about a lot, when we're having big discussions with big differences in values, and we're able to share a polity with those very people who disagree with us on the big things that we care about. So these are not solutions that are going to make everything go away, but I hope they're solutions that can get us out of the tired sort of scripts that we all play in behaving in these sort of big partisan bickering contests, and instead get us to be able to better have those arguments that can better both convince our opponents and let us have the opportunity to listen better to one another. Thank you so much again for the opportunity, for your attention. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. The first that I have on my Q&A says, I'm a teacher for 9th and 12th graders. What can I suggest is the best way to help them understand misinformation in today's society, especially on social media sites? So I think, to some extent, I think we did a really great job of what we called media literacy over the past couple of decades. And what we ended up was teaching people that they should be so cynical about the facts that they find in newspapers and in the media that they should think that sort of nothing really matters, nothing's really true. I think what's most important is to try to help young people understand why a given person says what they said. So again, I'm basing this on the point that relatively little of what we see on social media is actually literally untrue. What's important about it, and the places where it matters, is actually when it is true, but it's being interpreted in misleading ways, or it's not really making it's not building to the kind of argument that it ought to make. So one of the things I like to do, I teach a first-year seminar. So those young people are just 1 year beyond the 12th graders that you're talking to. And in my first-year seminar, one of the things I try to do is get my students to take a look at a tweet or a social media post or an article that they think is wrong, and try to tease out which pieces they can prove are factually wrong. And usually it's not that much, but in addition to figure out why it is that wrongness matters. What's the argument that they're trying to make? And how can the argument that they make be made better instead? So another way of saying this is, what would you say to the person who wrote this article, who created this tweet, if you had them in the room with you? And as it turns out, most people don't respond well to you're saying, you're crazy, you're lying, you're telling untruths. They respond much better to saying, you know what, I see what you said, but that seems really surprising to me because I actually know something else, and here's something else that I know. So I think one of the things that's really important about good argument in almost any context is the ability for that argument to go back and forth, to not just be a one-off, like, let me say something and then get out of the room, but to say something, to listen how the audience hears it, to understand how they interpret it, to listen to their point, to say it again. So I like to use the misinformation process, the one that you're mentioning here, to help young people, to help students try to figure out why the thing was posted, and then how they might counter it in a way that is faithful to the person or the entity that created it. Okay, the next one says, it seems that before Trump people could have civil discussions, but now it's impossible. Why? I want to do something a little odd here, which is, I want to know who thinks they're being uncivil. Do we think that the Trump people that you're talking about think that they are being uncivil, or are they being faithful to a truth that they believe is the case? Are they being angry at a situation that they consider to be unacceptable? My point here is not to excuse incivility, although as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I actually think civility is less important than saying the thing that you want to say. That is being frank. So rather than saying the question of whether they can be civil, I think the question is, why are you saying what you're saying? Can we get into one of these back and forths like I was talking about in the answer to the prior question? Can we get into a way to have a conversation that will help me understand why you're saying what you're saying? And maybe will help you understand why I think you're wrong about it. Again, is everyone going to agree? No, they shouldn't. But having that argument is likely, in fact, I'll say, to be more persuasive than saying, geez, you're being uncivil. Okay, how can there be, Donald Wortman says, how can there be constructive argument or discussion when one or both sides have no respect for the other? So once again, the reason I like the idea of argument rather than discussion is that argument is something that we do in order to try to persuade one another. We think the other person is wrong. We're not just here for a nice academic discussion. And I think, in fact, one of the ways that our programs in civil discourse, which are very common at many universities, go wrong is that they try to show that we can have civil discourse about things that aren't actually all that important. I have a colleague who works in a civil discourse program, and the thing that they start off with is a big debate about whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. And then we're going to move from is a hot dog a sandwich or not to is your presidential candidate a threat to democracy? And somehow we're supposed to see these two as being the same kind of discussion. They're just not. So I don't think actually that respect for the other is a necessary component of having a good argument. I do think that listening to the other, that is trying to understand the other, that is a necessary component. But you can understand things you don't respect, and you can be understood by people who don't respect you. So I think that's my best answer to Donald Wortman's question. Philip Weiner says, has there always been this lack of civility? No. It is certainly the case that by any measure, our public sphere has gotten more uncivil over the course of the long 20th century, which is not to say that there wasn't incivility before, but it has gotten more so. There's all sorts of diagnoses that we can make. Certainly incivility and misinformation grew starting with the introduction of satellite dishes and cable television in the 1970s and 80s. And these offer the opportunity more and more to talk to only people that you already agree with, and that certainly tends to increase incivility. So no, there has not always been this lack of civility. I would make another point too, though, which is right at the same time that we're talking about how unruly and uncivil our public sphere, our public discussion has become, it's also the time that our public sphere has become much more inclusive. That it's over that course of the time, basically since, let's say, 1954, that women have been more and more able to join the civil discourse, that people of color, that indigenous people, LGBTQ people, immigrants, that the increasing inclusion in the civil sphere has also paralleled this increasing lack of civility. And so I think we need to be really careful about when we're really talking about incivility and when we're just talking about expanding the sphere to make some people really uncomfortable. Okay, someone says, I see people watch or listen to networks or read social media that supports their view. When you say, but do you read or listen to networks or articles that have opposing views? The answer is always, of course, but you can tell by what they say that they may hear it, but they're not listening. I think that's absolutely right. I am very guilty of that myself. I do listen and read stuff I disagree with, but I usually read it in the mode of trying to figure out why it's wrong. And I listen to stuff I tend to agree with, and I tend to be in the psychological mode of agreement. So I really try to avoid that. I think it's a matter of being in a really specific sort of psychological state where you're ready to listen to the ideas that you disagree with. There's some interesting psychological experiments that turns out that there's some things you can do to help people be in those modes. One thing straightforwardly is you can pay them. If you stick people in a room and you pay them to have better outcomes, to have better argumentative behaviors, turns out they're able and willing to do it. So it's not that people are not able to be good arguers, it's that they're not incentivized to be good arguers. The other thing that you can do, though, is we're in an environment where many of us have been told that losing an argument, losing the argument that we're in the middle of, is an existential threat. That if we lose this argument, our world is over. People like us won't be able to exist anymore. Our democracy is dead. And that's actually not a good way to listen to people you disagree with. If you're convinced that they're winning means you're losing everything, then you're going to do everything you can to make sure you don't lose that argument. So I think another thing that's really important is to help create a level of what sociologists call ontological security. That is to try to create a situation where people feel secure enough that they're able to listen somewhat generously to one another and try to understand why others think what they think. But I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing is, it's easier. It's hard work to pay attention to things that you fundamentally think are probably wrong. It's much easier to listen to and agree with stuff as it comes in. Again, that's another well-documented finding in psychology. Okay, I saw recently that Finland starts at a very early age in school to train the children to be critical and investigate information. Do you know how they are running this program? No, I don't know anything about the Finland program. It sounds like a good idea to me. I do think what I see among my students who are granted a highly selected group of young people is that they're actually really good at discerning true from false. They're not that good at discerning good from bad or important from unimportant. And so I'm not actually sure that just being critical and investigating information is sufficient for us to be able to build a better democratic argument culture. Okay. Okay, so you mentioned the demonstrations regarding Israel. If one side says that Israel should cease to exist, i.e. from the river to the sea, what type of discussion is possible if you believe that Israel should exist? I actually think there's lots of opportunities for this one, and I think one of the interesting things in this field is that I think we're spending more time actually talking to people we disagree with on this than on almost anything else, and I think maybe that's partly why people are so uncomfortable. I think the answer is everyone has to say why they think what they think. So I'm presuming that the person who wrote this comment thinks that Israel should exist. I think presumably that person has reasons why. It's not just they woke up one day and felt that Israel should exist. So what I would ask you if I were opposing you in that position, and I'm not going to state what my position is on this questions, partially because it seems to change every week or so. But if I were your opponent in this discussion, I would say, well, tell me why Israel should exist. And furthermore, are there ways that Israel could continue to exist that don't threaten the things that I think are important? Let's say, for example, right, so the river to the sea argument is that there shouldn't be a fully ethnically based state. So is there a way we could imagine an Israel existing that doesn't violate the position that I'm holding? Now, it may well be true that when we have that whole discussion, when one side says Israel should cease to exist from the river to the sea, and the other side says Israel should exist, and everybody gives their reasons why, that the best we've done at the end of that discussion is everyone understands why the other side thinks what they think. And so maybe, maybe the pro-Palestinian protesters don't think that all Israelis are, Zionist oppressors. Maybe the pro-Israel proponents don't think that all Palestinians are anti-Semitic haters, because they come to understand what the reasoning is behind why people take the positions that they take. Again, agreement is too much to ask, but some level of respectful listening, of understanding what the points are on both sides, is a necessary piece of getting to a real compromise of some kind. Are we going to get there? I don't know. I'm not saying that this fixes all problems. I'm saying I'm saying this is the best bet we're going to be able to make. It's our best chance of getting to addressing some of those thorny questions. Okay, What advice do I have if I believe that someone is inherently lying to me? They're clearly not being truthful and they're in fact malicious. So that happens a lot. Um, a, a criminal lie, a real serious offense. Gosh, I'm not sure what a criminal lie is, but so here's what I think. First of all, in any significant debate or argument, it's actually not just two sides in a room. It's two sides and an audience. Um, and one of the things that I think is important about trying to do a good job of arguing in places like Twitter, which tend to be really toxic. Um, One of the things that's really important about trying to understand, trying to do a good job of arguing in a place like Twitter, is actually that there's this big third party out there, millions of people who may run across, who may be paying attention to a debate that's going on. And so if you're debating someone, it's not the case that you're going to be likely to convince the person that you're debating with. But there's almost always, in almost any kind of debate situation, there's an audience. And the audience may be much more malleable, much more ready to listen to reasons, much more reasons to, much more willing to consider sort of the multiple sides of an argument. So one thing I think is don't take the goal as convincing or arguing against just the opponent, but also recognizing the audience that is truly or metaphorically in the room. The other thing that I would say is I actually try to avoid the question of whether people are speaking in good faith or not, which is basically the question of like, does your opponent believe what they're saying? The reason for that is it really doesn't matter. What matters is what's out there in public. What matters is what everyone else can see and hear. So if someone's making an argument that they really don't believe, it really doesn't matter. What's out there in the world is that argument. So could it be the case that I don't know, Stephen Miller is making a set of arguments on behalf of the Trump campaign that he doesn't actually believe at all. He's just doing it to, to sort of be a troll or a provocateur. Yeah, it's possible. I have no way of knowing that. I don't think anyone else has any way of knowing that. What's much more important to the question is what are those arguments that he's making in public, and are there ways that opponents can successfully counter them without just saying, without just sort of identifying him as a bad actor. I think we spend much too much time calling our opponents bad actors and not enough time dealing with the realities of what arguments are out there in public and what we need to do to try to counter them as best we can. Okay. Donald Workman says, should the world have listened to Hitler and tried to understand his motives, strategies, and actions? All right, if any of you is familiar with Godwin's law, it states that at the first mention of the Nazis, the conversation is over. Now, I'm not going to actually obey that law, but I will say that arguing with the extremes is not the best way to come across a good argumentative strategy. That said, it actually would have been really strategically important to understand, and we tried to, well, I wasn't here, but people tried to understand the psychology that led to Hitler's behavior, to try to understand his motives, his strategies, his actions, if for no other reason than fully and accurately to counter those actions. So I think this happens a lot in these conversations about civil discourse, that people are like, well, there's really bad people out there, and I don't want to understand why they think what they think. Because in some sense, it's taken to be the case that understanding why they think what they think is in some way endorsing what they think. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's really important to understand why people think what they think who are wrong. And I think it's not difficult to say that Hitler was sort of our epitome of being truly wrong. But understanding is very different from excusing, from very different from endorsing or agreeing with. And so I think, yes, it is important, even when the people are the worst possible actors, is to try to understand why they're doing what they're doing, again, so that we can try and counter it. Okay, any thoughts on how to avoid ever-expanding conversations that go everywhere and nowhere? E.g., yeah, but what about that other thing that I really want to talk about? That's from Tom Bascom. I don't have great answers to that. One of my colleagues who teaches at a small college calls this, I think he called it sea lioning, which is about the sort of constant just retort versus retort after retort after retort. And what about this other, and then the sort of shifting the conversation, shifting the terrain when one side is over. At some point, you're an exhausted arguer. You have every right to sort of say, you know what, we've been talking long enough. I think I'm done. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I do think that you always have the right to ask someone why they said what they just said. And so, if you felt like you were kind of getting somewhere, persuading someone, and then suddenly they change the topic to something else, it's totally reasonable to switch back and say, wait a second, um, uh, you know, um, you changed the subject. We weren't done from before, right? So you have power in a conversation, although not absolute power, of course. But I don't have great answers for the kind of what we might call the trolls, like the people who are just there because they want to create an argument. Okay. There are never wanting persons of violent and undertaking natures who, so they may have anything and will take it at any cost, from Francis Bacon in 1600. Is it still relevant? Yes or no? Gosh, sure, it's relevant. Again, I hope you don't see this as a cop-out. It's fair if you do. I think what's most important in a democracy, in a democratic culture, is the set of those is the set of arguments that are out there in public. And it really doesn't matter if the people making them are trying to just plunder and take what they will at any cost. The nice thing, the good thing about a democratic society is that what it does is it affords people the opportunity to make an argument for what they deserve and for what others deserve, and to have that argument be tested in a back and forth conversation. So is it relevant? Sure, it's relevant. I don't think that calling our opponents persons of violent and undertaking natures is likely to help us win arguments with them and make us end up persuading them in a different way. Okay. What is critical thinking? Gosh. I think I'm not going to try and attack that one. That's a whole field of study. Does the factual predicate selected lead to the conclusion? So if we take a fact, number one, America is the home of the brave and free with free speech, liberty, and opportunity. Or number two, that racial slavery is the original taint that has never been removed and diminishes or obliterates American achievements. So this is great. And in fact, those two statements are sort of the two poles of the chapter that we're writing right now on the history problem. Here's the thing. Those are not facts, right? Those are certainly not super facts. They're not things that everyone agrees are true. They're claims, and they're claims that are based in evidence, but that they ask us to believe more than just the evidence itself. So America is the home of the brave and free with free speech, liberty, and opportunity. So there are pieces of that statement that are demonstrably true. You could do empirical research and figure out how true they are. There are also pieces that are asking you to draw a broader conclusion than is simply warranted by the evidence itself. So the question is to ask your opponent or ask yourself to do a good job of stating what we call the warrant of that claim. And the warrant is, you can think about the warrant as being the reason why the facts or the evidence presented ought to be interpreted in the way that you've interpreted. That's what the warrant is. And so what I would ask the people taking both of these positions is, tell me why I should draw the conclusion you have from the evidence that you've presented me. Now, I think it actually is almost indisputable that racial slavery is the original taint of the American experiment, but that so it has never been, in fact, removed. That is, we can find historical lineages and genealogies by which contemporary inequalities trace back to the origins of racial slavery. The question of whether it diminishes or, more importantly, obliterates American achievements, that's a claim. That's not a claim to evidence. That's a claim that has to be warranted based on the evidence that racial slavery is the sort of the original sin of the American founding. And so, again, what I would ask someone taking either of these positions is work with me to figure out what this warrant structure is. Now, I actually think the answer to number two is very complicated. That it can be at the same time the original sin and make American accomplishments always partial, but at the same time warrant that that those accomplishments themselves are all the more extraordinary because they were burdened with this sort of moral original sin. We can talk about this in lots of different ways, but that's how I would go about asking that question. Okay, how has evolution of humans created a void in human behavior to the acceptance of losing an argument? I think I'm seeing that we're about done, so I'm going to answer this one really quickly, and then we can wrap up. I don't think this is an evolutionary question at all. Human willingness and ability to accept losing an argument has changed much more quickly than any kind of genetic substrate or evolution has. I think what's actually going on is that we've both been encouraged to think about the questions that we're thinking about as existential, that losing this argument is going to be the end of everything, and so that really gives us bad incentives to argue well. It gives us bad habits. And we've created a technological environment that lets us play to our very worst psychological tendencies, which is to be really angry at people that we never engage with and to make ourselves feel better by engaging with people that we already know we agree with. Thank you. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciated it. And I hope the conversation was great for you all as well.